Hi everybody, welcome to the endocrine system. This is our new topic for Biology 2301, Human Physiology, where we're going to spend some time talking about all the different glands, or the different kinds of glands in your body, as well as all the different kind of endocrine glands in your body, endocrine glands and organs. One of the first things we want to do, we're going to be starting with Objective 34, and we really want to kind of give you some background on different kinds of glands, what makes up a gland, glandular secretions, and then we're going to spend an awful lot of quality time with all of those different endocrine glands. So we know that back in the beginning we talked about homeostasis and how there's a constant feedback loop that's going on in your body to continually regulate various levels. All our processes need to be kept in narrow limits, from body temperature to your amount of oxygen to the amount of blood glucose that you have. And when we talked about homeostasis and feedback loops, we said that communication was really the key, and that there are two systems in your body that do most of the communicating, and they do it through chemical release. That's the nervous system, which we've spent a lot of time on, and the endocrine system. Now, your nervous system releases neurotransmitters, which can have really fast responses. The endocrine system releases chemicals as well, called hormones. Now, hormones generally have a bit slower response, but a longer lasting response. So we're going to see this feedback loop communication system in the body, but using just a different kind of chemical. Now, in order for us to do that, we're going to talk about what a gland actually is, and then we'll differentiate between the different kinds of glands. So, to define a gland can consist of one cell or a group of cells. These are epithelial cells that are able to secrete a substance either into a duct, onto the surface of the body, or into the blood. We can classify the glands in two groups. There can either be endocrine groups or exocrine. Now, in the exocrine glands, which is a picture that you're seeing here, exocrine glands secrete their product into a duct or a tube, and these ducts or tubes empty that secretion either onto the body surface, think like a sweat gland or an oil gland, or into a body cavity, think saliva or digestive enzymes. So you can see here, this is the parotid salivary gland right here, just anterior to your ear, to your external ear. And this large salivary gland releases saliva by way of a duct or a tube into the oral cavity, so that you can actually start to kind of chemically digest food, specifically carbohydrates actually. Endocrine glands do not have these kinds of tubes, like how your sweat gland has a long pore and oil glands use the hair follicle. Endocrine glands are what we call ductless glands, and they secrete their hormones, their release, directly into your bloodstream. No tube. So again, endocrine glands are ductless. Their secretions, they just leave the cell, they enter the extracellular fluid, and from there they diffuse right into your bloodstream. So your bloodstream is how hormones actually travel throughout your entire body. The secretions of an endocrine gland are always called hormones, and they can regulate so many different physiological activities. We're going to address all of those today. This is a great picture of the various endocrine glands as well as the endocrine organs in your body. You can see the endocrine glands are listed as your pituitary, up here at the base of your brain, your thyroid here in your neck, as well as your parathyroid glands in your neck. We'll also talk about your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. We're going to mention your pineal gland, which is also here. This is located in your brain. And the thymus gland, this thymus gland is located just anterior to your heart, overlying the major vessels. Now, we're also going to detail your pancreas. We'll talk about your hypothalamus, also part of that brain. And we'll talk about the testes and the ovaries. But why do we talk about them in a different category? Because your hypothalamus, your pancreas, your ovaries, and your testes are endocrine organs. What that means is they're actually able to secrete or have functions that are not just specific to releasing hormones. So your pituitary gland, for example, the only thing it does is release hormones. Many different kinds, but it does nothing else besides release hormones. Whereas your pancreas can release hormones, but also digestive enzymes. So in fact, your pancreas is both an exocrine and an endocrine gland. So we're going to see those differences as we go through each one of these structures over the next several pages. You know, hormones aren't the only type of chemical signal that uses the bloodstream or releasing factors. We've talked about neurotransmitters, but we also want to talk about some chemical types that are called autocrines and paracrine factors. Hormones, autocrine factors, paracrine factors are in the same category because of their release mechanism and also how they affect the distant cell, but there are slight differences that I thought I might bring up. For example, an autocrine factor is a chemical that exerts its effect on the exact same cell that secretes them. So what that means is, think auto is self. Here is the cell. It's going to release a chemical that affects its same cell. Now, why would it do that? So one of the interesting things is part of your immune system. If you don't have an infection, you want your white blood cells to be kind of at a low level so they don't, for lack of a better way to explain it, get bored and start to search for things to destroy, like your own tissue. So we keep our levels really low. But when you do have an infection, we want those white blood cell numbers to grow and grow quickly so we can fight it off. Interleukins, which is a great example of an autocrine factor, is a chemical that's released by a type of white blood cell called a helper T cell, and it stimulates the helper T cells so that they can proliferate or make more of themselves. And they can also activate other T cells, all beginning your immune response so you can fight something. A paracrine factor, we call these locally acting because these are chemicals that affect other cells than those that secrete them, but they do not enter your bloodstream to do that. So think of them as affecting a nearby cell. So here would be the cell that is releasing that chemical, and a nearby cell or an adjacent cell would actually be the target of those chemicals. Some really good examples of a paracrine factor would be histamine and something called PDGF, or platelet-derived growth factor. Histamine gets released in your stomach and can act on your stomach lining to actually cause other cells to be promoted to release acid. So some people who have too much acid actually are histamine, that will take a histamine reducing cell, what we call an H2 blocker, so that you don't release so much acid. Platelet-derived growth factor is, just imagine what the word says. It actually tells the platelets to help to rebuild a damaged vessel wall or damaged tissue. So derived growth factor means that it's actually helping you to repair, and that would follow an injured site, like after blood clotting, for example. So hopefully you can see that this is autocrine, same cell, paracrine, nearby cell, and then we've got the endocrine. You see, we would have cells that release chemicals, but those chemicals would enter into the bloodstream and travel to distant sites where they would affect cells. That's the difference. This would be a hormone of an endocrine gland. So again, autocrine factors and paracrine factors are not considered hormones. They are chemical types, but only hormones will affect a distant cell. Hormones, again, are released into the bloodstream. They travel through the bloodstream, and they affect cells at a very distant location from where they were released. I like this picture because there are a lot of different chemical messengers, all of which keep us regulated as part of that homeostatic mechanism. We spent a lot of time on neurotransmitters, and helping us to understand how they travel, those neurotransmitters travel across synapses. And this is a really nice picture because it will then help you to understand the difference between the autocrine factor, that paracrine factor, and the endocrine gland. And so when you've got some time, please do read through this slide because I think it's a wonderful comparative slide. It has some really great examples. But our focus today is really going to be all about hormones. Hormones released by endocrine glands. And these are just unusual, kind of unique chemical secretions that have effects on distant cells. But the effects based on the hormone can be vast. And so this list of 7 different functions, this certainly is not a complete list. We're going to see a lot of different function over the next couple of minutes, maybe next half hour. But I wanted to put something small down so you could see this scope of what all of our hormones can do and do for us every single day. So number 1, it says hormones regulate the composition and volume of extracellular fluid. That means how much water you actually have in your bloodstream and in the tissues that surround your cells. That water balance is actually maintained by a hormone, specifically one we would call ADH. Hormones regulate our metabolism and our energy balance. We have thyroid hormone to thank for that, or be mad at if we don't have enough of it. Hormones can help to regulate contraction of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Absolutely. We have a number of hormones. For example, did you know that epinephrine is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone? And that certainly can affect our smooth muscle and cardiac muscle contractility. Homeostatic response to emergency. What that kind of means is it's all about wound healing, maintaining our blood glucose levels. There are 2 hormones, epinephrine again, and another one called cortisol. They're actually going to help to kind of keep our body running even under times of duress. Regulating aspects of the immune system. We also have cortisol to affect our immune system as well. Regular growth and development. You can thank growth hormone for that. And 7, that's a big one, but it contributes to processes of reproduction, gamete production like egg and sperm, nourishment of a growing embryo, delivery of an embryo, all regulated, even nutrition of the embryo or fetus, if you think of breastfeeding, all regulated to hormone release. Now, Objective 35 wants us to understand how it is that hormones are able to work at their active sites, both within a cell and at the cell membrane. And one of the things we really have to understand to get to the mechanism of hormonal action is the kind of chemical makeup that each hormone type has. So hormone chemistry becomes really very important. If you look at your notes, it says that chemically there are 3 classes of hormones. There are lipid derivatives, amino acid derivatives, there are peptides, and there are proteins in the same category. Some of these have various solubilities, meaning water soluble or fat soluble, and some of these have certain sizes. We have to understand both. Okay? So let's take a look at just the amine hormones, and we'll take a look at the steroid hormones on this slide. So let's start down here, the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are a lipid, a fat. They have a ring-like structure, and they're based on the structure of cholesterol. They're primarily produced in the adrenal cortex and in the gonads, and some great examples would be estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, aldosterone. And you see, this is important, and I bolded that. These are fat soluble. They're not very large, based again on cholesterol, but the most important thing that we can know about a steroid hormone is that they are fat soluble, and that's going to have a great deal to do with how they're able to act on the cell that they target. Now let's take a look at the amine hormone. These are teeny tiny little hormones. These are the simplest hormone. They're derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine. We've seen the biogenic amines and catecholamines before, because we're also seeing, again, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These, remember, are not just neurotransmitters. They also can act as hormones. Also, your thyroid hormone is an amine. It's also very, very small. A single amino acid, so that's a pretty tiny, yet water-soluble group of hormones. So these are water-soluble and tiny, and lipid-soluble hormones down here with our steroid-based hormones. Now let's take a look at these two middle classes. The two middle classes are much, much, much larger hormones, Peptide, if you think about a peptide is just, I kind of consider it a protein wannabe. It's at least 3 amino acids put together, up to 200 amino acids, whereas a protein are just incredibly, incredibly long, hundreds, maybe thousands of chains of amino acids. So these are really kind of the same thing. They're just really long chains of amino acids. Just these are medium big and these are really big. Okay? So peptide and protein hormones are huge chemicals relative to our amines and our steroids. Most of our hormones fall into these classes. So oxytocin, ADH, insulin, glucagon, growth hormone, parathyroid hormone, all of the releasing and the inhibiting factors all fall into this kind of larger class. So it's really going to have an effect on how they target that distant cell. They're really big, but again, they're water soluble, so keep that in mind as we kind of go forward. I like this slide because again, it's just telling us, based on those two categories, how it is that they affect the distant cell. Peptide proteins, peptide hormones, protein hormones, and the smaller catecholamines all will affect a distant or target cell by binding to a receptor that's on the plasma membrane. Okay, so again, all of the amine, peptide, and protein hormones will bind to their target cell's receptors that are located on the plasma membrane. And so in order to affect that cell, it's kind of a complicated process where we're going to use second messengers, and we're going to detail that. Only the steroid hormones and, interestingly, thyroid hormone have their receptors to affect that target cell within the cell itself. These hormones are able to actually just enter that target cell and bind to receptors on the inside, so they have a little bit more of a direct action. It says in order for hormones to have any effect, they have to bind to receptors. They can bind to receptors either on the cell membrane, like a peptide, a protein, or a catecholamine, or within the cytoplasm or even within the nucleus of the cell. And that would be only the steroid hormones and thyroid hormone. And the difference is solubility. Steroid hormones especially, and thyroid hormone based on its size, they actually have an easy way in because fat solubility. Whereas the peptides, the proteins, and the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, because of their solubility, they must remain outside the cell. They cannot cross that plasma membrane, so their receptor will be on the outside. Let's take a look at that because this is actually a very interesting process. Now, one thing I keep doing is I keep saying the target cell, but what the heck is a target cell? I hope you were asking that. A target cell is the actual cell that has the receptor for the hormone. You see, your hormone doesn't kind of have a radar, and when it gets released into the bloodstream, know exactly where to stop in your body to find that one cell that it wanted to affect. No radar. How does it know when these hormones are actually washing over all of your cells from the bloodstream? How does it know what is the target cell that's going to bring about the action that we want to elicit? The target cell is called the target cell simply because it has the receptor for the specific hormone. So, for example, this secreting cell, this endocrine cell, would release its hormone, and it's going to travel over all your cells. But only those that have the receptor would be affected. If this cell had no receptor for the hormone, then it would just ignore that hormone and go about its day. These hormones also don't change what the target cell does. It's just going to kind of turn that target cell on or off or make it work faster or more diligently, but it's not going to change it. If that cell was meant to grow bigger, then the hormone will make it grow bigger. If that cell was meant to use more oxygen, then that hormone will make it use more oxygen. But it's not going to make it do something that it wasn't normally planning on doing. So in this little section, we really want to actually take a look at the very detailed mechanism where a hormone can affect that target cell. And we know that there's a big difference based on solubility of how your steroid hormones work and how your water-soluble hormones work, like the peptides and the proteins and the amines. So we're going to take the easier one first, and that's the steroid hormones, because it's actually a direct action where your steroid hormone, because it's lipid soluble, can diffuse directly across that target cell membrane, even potentially into the nucleus, and bind to receptors that are inside that nucleus. Again, the hormones that can do this are your steroid hormones, as well as thyroxine or thyroid hormone. There's a unique receptor within the nucleus that can bind specifically that hormone, that steroid hormone, or that thyroid or thyroxine hormone. And interestingly, when it does bind, it's going to create this receptor hormone complex, which can then alter the function of our DNA, potentially making a gene translate, creating a protein that cell needed to make, but we simply turned on the process. So I wrote down for us that specifically the hormone would bind to a DNA-associated receptor protein. This interaction turns on the gene. By binding here, and that receptor, we have the DNA-associated receptor, we bind here so that we can actually turn on our DNA to produce what we call messenger RNA. The messenger RNA is just a copy of a gene segment. It's translated by organelles called ribosomes into a unique protein. So this protein could be an enzyme that might change the metabolic activity of the cell. So you have to imagine a hormone like thyroxine. Thyroxine alters our metabolism, our body's cells' use of oxygen. It's going to turn on the process of cellular respiration when thyroxine would bind. It's going to burn more oxygen, it's going to burn more calories, and produce more heat. I wish my thyroxine would work a little harder, because I've been cold this winter. Thyroxine tends to work harder in winter months to produce more heat. Now, this mechanism, I'm sure, looks a lot more complicated to you. But you know what? You've seen this before. Do you remember that certain neurotransmitters require the use of a G protein? Well, certain hormones require the use of a G protein as well. So we're really just going to revisit this process and look at the different kinds of second messengers that could actually bring about the effect in the distant cell. Remember that this type of response, this type of mechanism, is only used for water-soluble hormones like the peptides, the protein hormones, and our amines. We have a couple of different kinds of second messenger systems. So it's really the same process, but the second messenger is really what's going to be bringing about the change in that target cell. The big difference is we have a hormone, which we're going to call our first messenger. It's bringing the message to the cell that says, hey, do something. Our hormone is not able to diffuse across the plasma membrane. It can't get in because it's water soluble, and our phospholipid bilayer is mostly lipid. So our hormone will bind to a receptor that's on the plasma membrane, which ultimately would trigger the G protein. This G protein is triggered, which produces what we call a second messenger system, and that second messenger system will bring about the response inside that cell. Maybe open a protein channel, make a protein, activate an enzyme, stimulate a cellular secretion. Whatever that cell was meant to turn on and do, that second messenger is going to enable it to do it. We're going to take a look at different kinds of second messengers, cyclic AMP being the first one, but we'll also look at diacylglycerol and inositol triphosphate. So here's that picture again, same exact picture, but now we're going to go through the steps. Number 1, the binding of the hormone to our protein receptor in the target cell activates a specific enzyme, another protein, called the G protein. So normally your G protein is inactive, but when your hormone binds, it activates our G protein. Now your G protein, here it is, it's in its active form, can now be used as an enzyme to create our second messenger. ATP is converted into our second messenger called cyclic AMP by the enzyme of our G protein. So it says that cyclic AMP is converted from ATP to cyclic AMP by our G protein enzyme. The cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger to activate cytoplasmic enzymes like a protein kinase. It can also open ion channels. It can activate enzymes, stimulate cellular secretion, open ion channels, turn on processes, whatever it was meant to do. These groups of hormones would be the ones that would use cyclic AMP as their messenger to bring about that response in the cell. So for example, let's say it's glucagon. Glucagon actually helps us to release sugar into the bloodstream from cells where it's stored. Maybe you forgot to eat breakfast, so you have to release sugar so that you can still go about your day. So if glucagon would bind, that would activate the G protein. The G protein would form the second messenger. The second messenger would activate enzymes that break down glycogen into glucose, and then glucose could be released from the cell into your bloodstream so that you actually have some sugar to run your brain for the day until you go eat breakfast. So that's just one way it would normally do. That cell is able to release glucose, but it just wasn't unless glucagon is present. This is the exact same process, but it's just a different picture, which I thought maybe some people might like. It's a little simpler. But we actually, again, have that hormone. It binds to a receptor on the plasma membrane, which activates that G protein, which allows for the conversion of ATP into a second messenger. And that second messenger then is able to act within that cell to activate enzymes or turn on some physiological response. We get rid of that second messenger, and the process is done. Now, hopefully you'll see that this is a really similar picture, but not exactly the same. There are certain hormones, like your very small catecholamine epinephrine, for example, or there's a couple here. This is called thyrotropin releasing hormone, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, luteinizing hormone releasing hormone, and oxytocin. There's just a few hormones here that don't use cyclic AMP. They use slightly different second messengers. And it's not a difficult process, but I just thought I would show you that difference. So again, maybe we're talking about antidiuretic hormone, okay? This is the specific hormone that makes you retain water. So maybe you didn't drink enough water today and you need to keep more water in your bloodstream from the kidneys. So ADH would help you to retain more water, pull more water in. So maybe ADH binds to our protein receptor. That's going to activate our G protein. The G protein will then activate our second messenger. In this case, by activating the second messenger, we're just going to convert this molecule, this is called phosphatidylinositol, or phosphatidylinositol triphosphate. It's going to activate that to become one of two second messengers, either if you follow diacylglycerol here or inositol triphosphate here. And either that diacylglycerol could open protein channels, for example, or inositol triphosphate could cause for protein kinases, opening ion channels, protein production. Same exact process, but we're just using IP3 and DAG instead of cyclic AMP. They're second messengers, but for slightly different hormones. Now that we have a little bit of chemistry under our belt, and certainly the mechanisms of how hormones function, and certainly revisit that if you like, but now we're going to spend a little bit more time on the hormones themselves, what structures they are released from, what structures they're produced inside of, and then of course what they do with their target cells. Objective 36 has us talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And they're intimately linked, and so that's why we talk about them together. This picture, if you can imagine, your brain is up here. And this is the base of our brain where the hypothalamus is located. And then there's a little stalk of tissue called the infundibulum, and your pituitary gland hangs off of that. So your pituitary gland actually rests just below your brain, or the hypothalamus. We know that our pituitary gland, we also call this the master endocrine gland, sits inside that pocket of bone called the sphenoid bone. There's a little pocket in there called the sella turcica, and that houses and protects your pituitary. And again, that's just underneath your hypothalamus. If you look at this picture, I'm hoping that you'll see that it's kind of a two-lobed gland. So there's kind of an anterior portion of our pituitary, and there's a posterior portion of our pituitary. And so we kind of want to talk about that because both the anterior and the posterior pituitary have the ability to secrete different hormones. So the posterior pituitary gland, which we also call the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis is just a fancy word for pituitary gland. So it is intimately associated with your brain, with that hypothalamus, so we call it the neurohypophysis. It actually stores and releases two hormones that actually the hypothalamus makes. Whereas the anterior pituitary gland, which we would call the adenohypophysis, this releases hormones that regulate a whole range of body activities, anywhere from you growing to your metabolism to reproduction. Many of the hormones of the anterior pituitary are called tropic hormones, and here's the word, tropic, because their release controls the release of other hormones. And to make matters more complicated, their release is controlled by the release of other hormones by the hypothalamus. So I promise we will follow this together. This picture I copied from your lab manual. In your lab manual, in the pictorial study guide, this is figure 10, so you can look it up in your lab manual. This shows us how the hypothalamus affects the anterior pituitary and how the anterior pituitary's hormones can affect other glands. So I have a little kind of a flow chart for you here. Your hypothalamus can release hormones that are called releasing hormones. And those releasing hormones could affect the pituitary gland, which releases hormones that are called tropic hormones that go to another distant gland and causes them to release their hormones, which will ultimately affect our body. Pretty complicated, right? But it's just kind of having a bunch of middlemen along the way. Let's think about how we metabolize. Okay? Let's take a look right here. This is one that you'll see. TRH. This is actually part of a lab that you'll do. TRH stands for, it will have an acronym that's thyrotropin releasing hormone. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. When this is released, this causes the pituitary gland to release a hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH then causes your thyroid gland to release a hormone called thyroid hormone, or thyroxine. Thyroid hormone, or thyroxine, then goes to all of your body's cells and has an influence over their metabolic rate, or how quickly you burn calories. So when we talk about, oh, my metabolism is slow, my stupid thyroid gland, well, it may not be your stupid thyroid gland. It is impossible, or it is entirely possible, that it could be the hypothalamus, it could be the pituitary, and it could be the thyroid gland. So there's all this feedback that's going to be involved in you regulating that metabolism. Please don't forget to look at this when you're doing your application homework as well, when related to the endocrine system. You have CRH affecting ACTH. You have growth hormone releasing hormone affecting growth hormone. You have TRH affecting TSH. You also have VIP, vasoactive intestinal peptide, affecting prolactin. And notice how the arrows are. TRH can also affect prolactin. And if you have prolactin, prolactin can inhibit TRH. So these are all negative feedback loops that will influence the release of each other. Let's take a little bit closer look at that, of the hormones of that hypothalamus and the pituitary in terms of those releasing and inhibiting. All up here, these are releasing and inhibiting hormones. More simply put, the releasing hormones simply turn on the anterior pituitary, and the inhibiting hormones simply turn off the anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary, if it gets turned on, then it can affect other endocrine organs. So releasing hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, and they simply stimulate the production and release of other hormones of the anterior pituitary. Whereas the inhibiting hormones simply turn off or inhibit the production of anterior pituitary hormones. Again, you're not going to continue to release hormones always. So for example, if the hypothalamus releases TRH, and TRH makes us affect TSH, this is metabolism, and TSH affects thyroid hormone to turn your metabolism up a notch, you're not going to keep it up forever. So a high amount of thyroid hormone would feed back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus said, oh, we have enough? Okay, let's turn that off now. Let's inhibit that. So now anterior pituitaries stop that process. So we're always in this feedback loop, one affecting the other, one affecting the other. So keep that in mind. This negative feedback loop not only turns these hormones on, but can also then feed back to turn them off. Here's what's really nifty about the hypothalamus and its effect on that pituitary gland. Why it has such a unique connection is because there's a really unusual blood vessel connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. There's a capillary network at the base of the hypothalamus called the it's called the median eminence. And that median eminence here combines to form what we call the hypothalamo-pituitary portal vessels. These vessels that you see here have a straight shot to your anterior pituitary. What that means is it's sort of like a 71. Instead of going around the city at 270, where if we release hormones here, you enter the bloodstream and go out the entire body, all the way around, and then finally make it to the anterior pituitary to then have an effect on those hormones, we're just going to do a 71. Directly from that hypothalamus, right straight through the middle of the city, into the anterior pituitary. A portal system allows for kind of direct blood flow from one structure to another. And this portal system, which we see here, is direct blood flow from the hypothalamus to that anterior pituitary. So those releasing and inhibiting factors can have a direct and immediate effect on the anterior pituitary. This is a really rapid response. It also helps us to not dilute those hormones as they go around the entire blood system. They actually can just be released in small amounts and directly affect that anterior pituitary. If you want to change that metabolism, we're going to start that ball rolling by affecting that anterior pituitary. This picture shows all of the various inhibiting and releasing hormones. Here again, just the same kind of picture where we saw that gonadotropin releasing hormone affecting now FSH and LH of the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone releasing hormone affecting growth hormone, okay, and somatostatin turning it off. This one is one that you're going to see in application and in lab, that thyrotropin releasing hormone affecting thyroid stimulating hormone to ultimately affect thyroid hormone and your metabolism. TRH, interestingly, also turns on prolactin, which is inhibited by dopamine. And then lastly, we have corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the response of adrenocorticotropic hormone, will ultimately affect cortisol release. This is a really great table to keep in mind, and it would be nice if you could remember which releasing hormones affected which major anterior pituitary hormones. We're going to stop here and then pick it up in the next video with objectives 37 through 42, which will actually go through all of the rest of the endocrine gland hormones. Thanks for listening, and then pick it back up right when you're ready.